In 1989, the 12th floor office suite of media mogul Tokuma Yasuyoshi played host to an unusual guest. Mr. Tokuma, head of Studio Ghibli's parent company, was one of the great wheelers and dealers of the Japanese media world. He was well acquainted with a wide variety of power brokers, be they politicians, celebrities, or yakuza. Still, there was something notable in having Sōsuke, the Prime Minister of Japan, essentially living in Mr. Tokuma's private suite. While employees worked on distribution deals for CDs, books, and movies on the floors below, Prime Minister Sōsuke was trying his best to stay out of sight. Something made difficult thanks to the highly recognizable streak of white in his otherwise black hair. The leader of Japan, only weeks into his tenure as Prime Minister, was actively trying not to be seen. At that moment, he was embroiled in a major scandal, and all because of a single geisha. It was the first year of the Heisei era, and Japan's economic boom years of the bubble era continued unabated. At this point in time, the idea of a powerful man being involved with a geisha was nothing shocking. And yet, when Nakanishi Mitsuko stepped forward to tell of her relationship with Uno, it spelled the end of his promising decades-long career. Sōsuke would go down as one of the shortest tenured prime ministers in Japanese history, the veritable Liz Truss of his day.
Liz Truss announcing her resignation today, making her the shortest-serving prime minister in UK history. In power for just 6 weeks, and spoke to the British people today from outside her 10 Downing Street office.
But Nakanishi Mitsuko did more than simply bring low her powerful paramour. By emerging from the shadowy world of the geisha industry, she broke a centuries-old code of silence. From the position of a kept woman, she challenged the mores of her society, in which men cheating on their spouses was the natural assumption. The flurry of discourse that surrounded Prime Minister Uno and Nakanishi Mitsuko shook the power centers of the nation, prompting questions about Japanese society that ring true even today.
今まで私黙っておりましたでしょ、泣き寝入りしておりました。でもあの方が総理になられた時にはね、絶対にこれはいけないと思ったんですよ。
Konnichiwa, yokoso, and welcome back to Unseen Japan. As always, I'm Noah Oskow. Today we have a story of political and personal scandal that shook the Japanese government. Now, before we get to the main story today, and even before I ask you to please like and subscribe, which I guess I kind of just did, so we'll say that counts, I should probably explain a pretty important part of the background of the story that may mystify the uninitiated. Now, considering that they're a trademark icon of traditional Japanese culture, there still tends to be a lot of confusion about exactly what and who a geisha is. Now, it just so happens that I've actually worked as an interpreter for quite a few geisha here in Tokyo for events that feature foreign guests. And I've had a bit of a chance to learn about the industry and its history and the people involved. But for the moment, I'll be brief. Yes, I can be brief. Geisha originate in the distant Japanese past, emerging from the intersection of performance and the pleasure districts of old Japan. In the past, they would often originate from impoverished backgrounds, being sold to geisha houses called okiya at a young age. These young, essentially indentured girls would become geisha, or geiko as they're called in Kyoto and Kanazawa. They would transition from being a minarai, which is like the shadowing stage, to being a maiko, which is an apprentice geisha. Eventually they would become a full-fledged geisha. Maiko are the ones you see with usually the deep white face paint, the extremely ornamented hair. By the time that they become full geisha, often they don't need to wear as elaborate makeup. Once they're a geisha, they can kind of tone it down a bit. They've established this real refinement in every aspect of their movement, of their presentation. In the past, this was all a process that would take quite some years, from young childhood all the way into young adulthood. Now things, of course, they are different these days. Tokyo, for example, you're not allowed to start working full-time until you're a full-fledged adult, so as a result, you had to be 20 in order to actually start working as a geisha in modern Tokyo. And that means that an apprenticeship starts much later these days, and of course the industry is also much smaller overall. There's a lot of good reasons why it's changed. This is an industry that's intrinsically connected with drinking, with partying, with nightlife, despite being, high class. These days, it's not uncommon for a woman to become a geisha later in life out of interest in traditional Japanese arts, or because they want to go into a new vocation. I have spoken with various geisha who have taken this path. Geisha are highly skilled, highly trained entertainers, and they all focus on some form of traditional performance. But most of all, geisha are highly skilled conversationalists. These days, geisha are often hired to perform, to entertain, and to interact with guests at traditional restaurants called ryote. Now, in my personal experience, geisha are the life of the party. They keep both conversation and drinks flowing, and they lead traditional drinking games. They bring forth an air of both refinement and fun to any event they're a part of. Now, the elephant in the room of any conversation related to geisha is the question of whether or not a geisha is a sex worker. The answer is, on its face, no. The industries, however, have always been intertwined. The historical geisha originally contrasted themselves to the oiran, who were the courtesans of the pleasure districts. Hiring a geisha is not hiring a sex worker. It's hiring a skilled traditional entertainer. However, historically the end game for a geisha was to try to find a danna, a patron. This would be a wealthy man who would buy the geisha from the geisha house and provide her with a comfortable life. For a geisha, this was a way to find a life of comparative luxury. But of course, it did have implications. So too did the controversial mizuage, the purchase of a geisha's first time. Now, the modern geisha practice has moved away from a lot of these now controversial aspects of the historical geisha industry. But the connection with nightlife and with the wealthy and the powerful, you need a lot of money to hire a geisha. These connections mean that aspects of the world of the geisha will, in my opinion, continue to retain many aspects of the old world of the flower and the willow for some time to come. Okay, now that we're done with that primer, let's get back to the story of Uno Sōsuke and the former geisha, Nakanishi Mitsuko. Uno Sōsuke's meteoric rise and stunning descent were born of yet another scandal, the largest of its time. The Heisei era had just begun, and the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, known as the LDP for short, was already in crisis. It began in 1988, the year before Hirohito, the Showa emperor, would pass away and the era would change. In that year, the so-called recruit scandal had shaken Japan's belief in its public institutions to the core. Academic Yayama Taro, writing in 1990, explained the depth to which the insider trading scandal impacted Japanese society. Like a single match, the recruit scandal has touched off a conflagration of skepticism that threatens to envelop all things political in Japan, but feeding the flames has been a whole complex of factors. Not only the resentments and fears of ordinary citizens whose dreams of home ownership have been shattered by the skyrocketing prices of land, but disgust for the politicians who seem to be the only ones making easy money from stocks and political contributions, and anger at the corruption of top officials in such central government agencies as the Ministries of Education and Labor. A hallmark series of articles by the Asahi Shimbun revealed that human resources company Recruit Holdings Co., Ltd., had bribed numerous high-level politicians and bureaucrats, as well as businessmen with shares of their company that had yet to go public. The sums were large enough and the web of persons involved so far-reaching that the affair was soon hailed as the worst since the infamous Lockheed scandal of the mid-70s. As the recruit scandal wound its way through endless media coverage and eventually to the courts, LDP leadership dropped like flies. Prime Minister Takeshita Noboru, already unpopular for initiating Japan's first consumption tax, resigned. Numerous cabinet members followed. The reputations of other prime ministers, past and present, were deeply affected. In 1990, Shinto Hasashi, president of telecommunications giant NTT, was sentenced to 2 years in jail. The LDP was in shambles. A new leader was needed, but so many of the top players of the party were implicated in the scandal. The furor around the bribery, the media coverage of which left the impression that everyone was on the take, seemed to threaten the LDP's nearly 4-decade-long stranglehold on national power. All the LDP could do was promise political funding reform alongside the selection of someone squeaky clean to lead the party. In effect, this meant someone whom the recruit company had considered unimportant to the point of not offering a stock bribe. The man for the job, it was decided, was Uno Sōsuke. Just who was this unlikely new prime minister, selected for both his unimpeachable character and relative obscurity within the party? Uno Sōsuke was born in 1922 in Shiga Prefecture, in a town near Lake Biwa, Japan's largest body of water. He came from a family of wealthy sake brewers, notable for their local political power. His recent ancestors had been town elders during the Edo era, and his grandfather had twice been mayor. It may well be that his family's prominence in local affairs spurred him to enter government for himself. In 1943, as the Pacific War raged, he entered Kobe College of Commerce, which is modern Kobe University, with an eye towards becoming a diplomat. Only 2 months later, however, Uno was called up to the front. He would never return to university. Following training, Uno spent the remainder of the war as a military accountant in Hamhung, northern colonial Korea. In August of 1945, the war ended with a total Japanese defeat. The Soviet army entered Korea, and Uno's regiment was disarmed. He soon found himself in detention, and from there he found himself on a Soviet ship bound for Nakhodka, the same port where Sugihara Chiune, the Japanese Schindler, would soon spend a year waiting for repatriation to Japan. But Uno had worse waiting for him. 2 years in a Siberian POW camp. The Soviet intendants forced Uno and his fellow prisoners to do hard labor in minus 35-degree temperatures. The prisoners suffered from insufficient nutrition and invasions of blood-sucking ticks. Uno tried to keep his spirits up by organizing haiku competitions. During his first New Year's Eve at the POW camp, he composed the following: "Human emotions fade from the faces of prisoners, white mist on our breath. Kido use shiroki iki kayofu." After a year and 8 months, Uno Sōsuke's ordeal came to an end. One of the millions of Japanese repatriated from the former imperial holdings after the war, he suddenly found himself back in his hometown of Shiga. There, a family connection in the publishing industry helped him get his diary released as Damoi Tokyo, Homeward Tokyo in Russian, after what he'd heard Soviet soldiers tell him. One of the first memoirs of a Japanese military man's experience in Siberian captivity. The book was a major success and was Uno's first claim to fame. In 1949, Uno made his way to Kyoto, and to the home of a compatriot from the Siberian internment camp named Hirose. There he happened to meet his friend's younger sister, Chio. The two prayed together at Kitano Tenmangu Shrine and soon fell in love. They were married, and Chio changed her name to Uno Hiroko. In 1951, Uno Sōsuke won his first public office, becoming a part of the is it Saga? No, Shiga. Becoming a part of the Shiga Prefectural Assembly. By 1955, he'd risen to prefectural vice chairman. It was just around this time that a young baby was born, though not a child of the Uno family. Somewhere out there in Japan, Nakanishi Mitsuko was coming into the world. While Uno Sōsuke was enjoying the first years of his assumed wedded bliss, the woman who would grow up to be a geisha and with whom Uno would entangle himself was breathing her first. As to the background of the woman who took down Uno Sōsuke, not much is actually known. While Nakanishi Mitsuko exploded into the public consciousness in 1989 and has maintained at least some notoriety since, occasionally granting interviews, she emerged from the highly secretive world of the flower and the willow, the euphemistic name for the geisha industry. And given the turbulent effects her decision to go public had on both powerful politicians and those in her one-time industry, it's not exactly surprising that she's attempted to live a relatively private life since the time of her revelations. But while the usual data points, birth date, where she was born, these are maybe a little bit hard to find, she still has spoken about many other aspects of her life. Nakanishi Mitsuko was born in the early post-war years, the youngest of 9 children. These were tough times throughout Japan as the country tried to emerge from the utter devastation of defeat in World War II. Nonetheless, there was a set pattern for the average woman in post-war Japan, and Nakanishi bucked almost all of these trends. She was married and had a son. Now that much is standard, but divorce, still taboo in those days, came not long after. Nakanishi took a job as a law firm OL, an office lady, which brought home the paltry equivalent of about $900 a month. Meanwhile, her ex-husband was moving on. "My ex-husband had remarried and he wanted to raise my child," she said during a 1989 press conference. "So I made up my mind to get up and do something." Nakanishi needed a better income if she wanted to maintain custody of her child. But what was a divorced OL to do in 1989? She thought back to her training as a young woman in the traditional arts, playing the 3-stringed shamisen, and learning utai, singing and dance, traditionally womanly arts, and all associated with the highly skilled and highly secretive world of the geisha. The 1980s were a boom time in the geisha world. Geisha had emerged as highly sought-after companions, skilled dancers, singers, musicians, and conversationalists during the Edo era. After the economic ruin of the war, the industry had faltered, giving way to cheap government-sponsored prostitution for the incoming occupation troops. Many geisha houses shuttered. Meanwhile, prostitutes servicing the American GIs in the amusement associations often wore makeup and kimono in the fashion of the geisha before them. When servicemen returned to the United States, they brought back the idea of geisha girls as prostitutes, conflating the two somewhat related but separate industries.
That you didn't understand. Were you ever in a tea house on the island of Japan? Have you ever even traveled over many 1,000 miles to see a pretty geisha girl dressed in Orient style?
As Japan recovered from the war and entered a period of incredible economic growth, there emerged among the upper class a desire to return to old forms. By the 1980s, when the bubble era meant many businessmen had extraneous cash, and more importantly, expense accounts like nothing seen before, the hiring of geisha came back into style. Paying a geisha to appear at business dinners is an extravagance and a status symbol, and the roaring 80s were all about economic status. This is the era in which Nakanishi Mitsuko entered Tokyo's Kakurazaka Hanamachi, one of the capital's most prominent geisha districts. And while Nakanishi had some reservations about the industry, especially the submissiveness it demanded of the women who engaged in it, she said she made up my mind to just cut it from my thoughts. It was in 1985, only 1 month into her new career, that Nakanishi Mitsuko met one Uno Sōsuke. Uno Sōsuke, it seems, had long enjoyed the company of geisha. Unfortunately, he wasn't always the most accommodating or kind companion. Following Nakanishi's public condemnation of her former patron, other erstwhile mistresses came forth, including a geisha who claimed she'd been in a relationship with a politician for a full decade. At the time of the scandal, the Washington Post reported the following. A geisha with a professional name Hatsuko, who said she maintained an affair with Uno from 1975 to 1984 and received 100,000 yen, about $700 a month, throughout most of this period. Hatsuko described Uno as an extremely cold man, and said that when she sought some affection from him on the occasion of their 10th anniversary, he replied curtly, "We've been doing it for 10 years?" Immediately thereafter, Uno ended the relationship, she said. Other reports showcased claims from partners going back to 1960, when Uno was just coming into his political own. Now, salacious as these stories may seem, their contents were considered par for the course when it came to powerful men. It was fairly standard for a man like Uno to count on his wife to take care of things back home, while all the time continuing to concentrate on political work and engaging in long-lasting affairs on the side. Uno's national-level political ambitions took center stage starting in 1958. After a series of losses, he finally made his way into the lower house of parliament in 1960 as a member of the LDP, despite coming in second in terms of overall votes to a Socialist Party nominee. At the time, the Socialist Party was the main opposition within Japan. Uno became close to the powerful Takeshita Noboru, who would eventually be his scandal-laden PM predecessor. In 1960, the two visited the Indian subcontinent in order to initialize what would become the Japan Overseas Cooperation Volunteers, Japan's answer to the US Peace Corps. This began Uno's long association with foreign affairs. A decade and a half later, Uno's star reached new heights with his first cabinet appointment. Named Director General of the Defense Agency by Shadow Shogun Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue, Uno faced an immediate crisis. On November 9, 1974, the Japanese gas tanker Yuyomaru No. 10 collided with a Liberian freighter traversing Tokyo Bay. Within hours, a massive explosion rocked the ship. Over 30 sailors perished. The fires on the Yuyomaru burned uncontrollably for weeks, with the Coast Guard and firefighting vessels unable to calm the blaze. At long last, Uno called up the Maritime Self-Defense Force. MSDF destroyers shelled the Yuyomaru, with submarines firing torpedoes from below. The burning vessel was sunk to the depths of Tokyo Bay. Tanaka Kakue's time as Prime Minister met a sudden end just as the Yuyomaru was coming to rest on the seafloor. Implicated in corruption, including using the name of a geisha he was involved with for various financial dealings, Tanaka resigned before yet another woman he was having an affair with could be called to the stand. With the collapse of the Tanaka cabinet, Uno lost his cabinet credentials in the blink of an eye. Not that he needed to worry, there would be plenty more where that came from. In 1976, Uno joined the Fukuda Takeo cabinet as Director General of Science and Technology. In this capacity, he worked alongside U.S. Trilateral Commission head Gerald C. Smith on issues related to nuclear technology. Smith called Uno the first Japanese to say things as they are. Various other cabinet positions would follow over the years. In the background, Uno reportedly continued to engage in numerous extramarital affairs. Now continually located in Tokyo, he was compared to a feudal samurai lord forced to live in the capital far away from his home province. His affairs were part and parcel of his lifestyle, distant as it was from his home life. He could scarcely imagine that these affairs, completely normalized as they were, would be his downfall. In 1985, that lifestyle led him to his first encounter with Nakanishi Mitsuko, then a geisha of the upscale Kagurazaka district. Nakanishi would later describe it as like a meeting ordained by fate. For Uno, she was simply the next in a long line of geishas.
でもあれも運命的な出会いというかね、小野先生が信号をですね、例えば青じゃなくて赤でね、2、3分でもね、遅れていらしたり、私がもう切り上げてお話をね、もう言ってしまったらもう本当にすれ違っていったでしょうね。
その時は宇野さん一人で。
お一人でした。
その時はあなたを見て宇野さんの表情っていうのはどういうふうな感じ？
じーっと顔をこう疑似してました。
あなたの顔じーっと見て。
こうやって上から下まで。
Uno took an immediate liking to her.
そして、こっちおいでと。
はい。
で対面になって。
はい。とにかく君は素人だろうって言われたんですね。で本当に素人なんですはいって申し上げて僕の名前を知ってるだろうっておっしゃったんです。そしたらもう存じ上げなかったので知りませんって言ったんです。今から考えると面白い芸者ですよね。その時なんかとなされたのかな、ちょっと言葉なくしてしまいましたね。
Uno, for a moment at a loss for words, ordered the matron to bring over one of his books to prove his stature.
ババア早く持ってこいっておっしゃったんですよね。
ババ
ア早く持ってこいっておっしゃったんですよ。
His uncouth words, spoken in the rarefied air of the geisha, shocked Nakanishi. They were a portent of things to come. Uno continued to pursue this new geisha who had caught his eye. At last, he finally arranged a meeting to become her dana, her patron, with all the nocturnal activities that would entail. His method of solicitation would become one of the most discussed aspects of the coming scandal.
いきなりその手をですね、こう握っておりましたらですね、この真ん中の3本の指をギュッと握りましてね、
要するに
これでどうだ、面倒見るってことはおっしゃらない、これでどうだっておっしゃったんだから。で、横になりなさいとおっしゃったんですよね。
そして横になれということは、要するにこれからこの3本をお手当てで出すから、そういう横になる関係にならないかという謎です。
Nakanishi assumed this meant 3 million yen per month, a standard allowance for a kept Kagurazaka geisha. Uno actually meant a mere 300,000.
月30万でどうだ。いいだろう。俺に腹を立てた芸妓が
That night, she says she denied his request to go to bed together. Eventually, though, she acquiesced to the offer. She'd later say that, in the geisha world, it's hard to say no. I had just gotten divorced, and I was not confident in myself. Their first night came months later at the Hotel New Otani. Uno upset Nakanishi by barking about how that money must have really helped you. Uno continually failed to ingratiate himself to Nakanishi, often acting boorishly. The Washington Post recorded that, at a small New Year's occasion, Uno humiliated her by gesturing derisively when he was asked by an older geisha if it was true that he and Nakanishi were carrying on a special relationship. Later, when the okasan of her geisha house sought to entertain Uno by performing a special dance for him, the future prime minister made little attempt to disguise his scorn for the old woman's efforts. That same okasan would later back up Nakanishi's stories about Uno, while simultaneously chiding her for breaking the geisha industry wall of silence. I understand a bit why she wanted to speak out, but a real geisha never talks. Uno eschewed geisha dana decorum at almost every turn. He would promise gifts, but Nakanishi says he never gave her any. The final insult came in 1986 when he suddenly broke off their year-long relationship. He claimed that a physician issued him a dokta stoppu, that's a doctor's stop, in other words, forbidding him medically from carnal relations. No traditional parting gift was forthcoming, a major taboo in the geisha world. Nakanishi was left in shock. This entire relationship, the type of which is usually supposed to provide a geisha with a comfortable retirement, had reaped Nakanishi a reported $21,000. Nakanishi, bereft of a patron and in debt to the expensive, elaborate kimono all geisha must own, left Kagurazaka behind. Her time as a geisha was relatively brief, not lasting much longer than her relationship with Uno. She moved on to other vocations, trying her best to get by. Eventually, lacking anywhere to turn to, she joined a Buddhist nunnery in Kagoshima. Uno, meanwhile, was about to start his career-making cabinet position as Minister of Foreign Affairs. In 1989, serving under his longtime colleague, Prime Minister Takeshita Noboru, Uno became the first Japanese cabinet-level official to visit Israel. This was an especially notable event given Japan's historically cool relations with the Jewish state. In 1972, the two countries briefly came together during the response to the Lod Airport massacre, in which members of the rogue Japanese Red Army had killed 26 people. However, the 1973 OPEC oil embargo had put an end to any warm relations between Israel and Japan, the latter of which bought 70% of its oil from Arab states. Meeting with his Israeli counterpart Shimon Peres in Jerusalem, Uno reportedly urged Israel to pull out of the occupied areas in the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai Peninsula. Japan's prosperity is the crystallization of its citizens' sweat and tears, he told Peres. We will not be giving a single monetary unit to a country that takes land by military force. Uno, of course, had been a soldier in Japan's military occupation of colonial Korea. Either way, the economic floodgates had already opened. Mitsubishi had already become the first Japanese car company to enter Israel that same year. In 1989, Nakanishi Mitsuko, no longer a geisha, happened to see a familiar face on the news. The media was in a frenzy over discussions of who would be replacing the disgraced Prime Minister Takeshita. Then, at long last, the name of Foreign Minister Uno Sōsuke was put forward. Nakanishi was shocked to see Uno's white shock of hair on the TV screen. How far her former paramour had risen. It had all happened behind closed doors, of course, as various LDP power brokers searched for a squeaky clean prime minister who could regain the lost trust of the masses. English language media seemed somewhat positive about Uno as a political operative. Uno, 66, is a voluble, piano-playing veteran politician of considerable intelligence who has earned generally high marks as foreign minister since November 1987, said the Washington Post. But it was also wondered whether he was perhaps simply a caretaker prime minister, doomed to be ousted when the LDP faced difficult elections in the coming months. Uno's new position was just as much of a surprise for Nakanishi as it was for the nation as a whole. She decided to reach out. She called up his office and she actually managed to get this new prime minister on the phone. When she offered her congratulations, his annoyed response was simply, "I can't have you calling me." The phone call ended and Nakanishi felt her hackles rising. Despite reservations, she decided to act. The people of Japan needed to know Uno Sōsuke, as she did.
そしてまた皆さんほらそのまだ下流側にねいらっしゃる方もいらっしゃるでしょうし、または水商売での方もいらっしゃるでしょうしね。私の場合はもう家族もいませんし、そしてもう、今回もいろんな意味で職場もそれから、いるお家もですね、せっかくいいところを見つけたのにとそれも全部ダメですしね、子供の件ももう会えないでしょうし、もう私何もこれで壊れるものありません。
Uno's sudden rise was seen by many in the political world as a windfall, and perhaps an unearned one. He'd managed to leap over many more qualified would-be successors by sheer dint of being a minor player. Some former Soviet internment camp POWs have all the luck, surely some grumbled. All that luck would last a mere 3 days. The Uno cabinet launched its running of the country on June 3rd, 1989. On June 6th, Sunday Mainichi broke the story of Nakanishi Mitsuko's tale of an upjumped, unkind lover. The rumblings of Uno's downfall could already be heard, even if only dimly. Nakanishi had phoned various newspapers telling them of how cruelly she felt Uno had treated her, but few had expressed interest in her story. At long last, one newspaper decided to run an interview with her, and that was the Sunday Mainichi. Its then editor-in-chief, Torigoe Shuntaro, would later explain his decision to run the story. That Uno's three-finger statement made this a case of prostitution, rather than a mere affair. Now, it's perhaps worth mentioning that in 2016, Torigoe's own attempt to run for governor of Tokyo Prefecture would be forestalled when his own sex scandal came to light. Back in '89, few outlets picked up on Sunday Mainichi's scoop. After all, it was thought how a prime minister runs his bedroom had little to do with his running of state. A general unwritten rule about not covering political sex scandals pervaded, and considering the amount of infidelity going on in the Japanese political world, one spurned geisha didn't seem worth the effort to break the taboo. Within weeks, this all changed. The impetus came, as it sometimes does with Japanese scandals, when foreign media took notice. The Washington Post began covering Uno's geisha-related woes, and the now international nature of the story spurred local newspapers to react. What started as a non-story quickly became the biggest media feeding frenzy in all of Japan.
なられた時にはね、絶対にこれはいけないと思ったんですよ。私だけの問題ではないと思います。また隣国に対してもですね、流血事件があっても即その対応できなかったあの方の態度を見てもおして知るべきじゃございませんか。そして下半身のことだからということなんですけども、下半身の問題じゃないです。人間性の問題です。
Nakanishi was candid in her discussions with media outlets, both local and international. She spoke of frustration with women's subservient roles in Japan, epitomized by her own former position as a geisha. Chief among her complaints was the rife cheating culture in Japan, which, she said, saw women putting condoms in their husbands' luggage when they went on business trips. Nakanishi's message rang true. Women's groups began to picket Uno's public appearances. LDP fixers could see the writing on the wall and urged their hand-picked PM to avoid giving stump speeches for any of the nominees for the upcoming elections. Uno went into veritable hiding high up in the Tokuma Shoten skyscraper, refusing any calls to respond to the controversies roiling the Tokyo streets below. His wife, however, stood by his side, saying she believed none of the claims against him. I consider all of them to be mere fabrications. Dechiage dato omotte orimasu. Then came the House of Councilors election. Taking place only a month after Nakanishi had gone public, the results were dramatic. Between the unpopular income tax, the after effects of the recruit scandal, and Uno's Geisha problem, the LDP suffered its first national defeat since its formation in 1955. The Socialist Party, led by Doi Takako, emerged victorious. Doi was the first woman to lead a major Japanese political party. The LDP's ability to pass legislature would be starkly curtailed. The very next day, Uno Sōsuke announced his resignation as prime minister.
Japan's Prime Minister Uno, who's embroiled in a sex scandal, announced his resignation tonight after his ruling Liberal Democratic Party suffered its first major defeat in parliamentary elections in 34 years.
He'd held the post for a mere 69 days. Now, if you'd like to understand just how easily prime ministers can come and go here in Japan, Uno is only the fourth shortest tenured prime minister in Japanese history. Uno retired from politics in 1996, by which time he had seen his party continue to be involved in numerous scandals. The LDP finally fell from power entirely for the first time in 1993.
It's a big table.
He died of lung cancer in 1998 at the age of 75, the very first of the Heisei-era prime ministers to pass away. With Uno out of power, his Geisha problem faded from the headlines. But for Nakanishi, the ramifications of her coming forward were more permanent. She felt she was now unhireable, and she languished in depression for some time. "Wherever I went, I was stared at," she said in a rare interview at the age of 61. "I couldn't set foot in Tokyo. My parents were dead, I was divorced, I had nothing to do with my son, and nowhere to go. An acquaintance introduced me to a temple in Shiga Prefecture, and I joined as an acolyte." Interviewers continued to hound her. She soon found work elsewhere and eventually became a licensed masseuse. She remarried, but went through a second divorce, swearing off the marital institution. Eventually, however, Nakanishi Mitsuko found peace. For a time, Nakanishi was the most infamous woman in Japan. She sparked conversations about the role of women in the country and about the culture of subservience and infidelity. She'd played a major role in bringing down a prime minister. In 2019, an aged Nakanishi Mitsuko was asked about what her state of mind had been like those 3 decades ago, when she'd prematurely ended Japan's Uno era. "My state of mind? It was my life, so rather than regretting not doing something, better to have regrets for actions actually taken. I was deadly serious, but then again, so was Mr. Uno. I couldn't weigh the pros and cons in that moment. The end results may not have benefited me, but I think there is meaning in what I did all those years ago." Alright everybody, thank you for watching this one to the end. When I came across a few sentences describing Uno's brief residence in the Tokuma Shoten Tower while reading Steve Alpert's book on his time at Studio Ghibli, I knew I had to take a deeper dive into the story. As I've said, I've had the honor of working alongside quite a few geisha here in Tokyo, and I've been fascinated by their incredible talent for traditional entertainment and their compelling life stories. They're impressive people, and the idea of a geisha taking down a prime minister, well, it's hard to miss the appeal of a story like that. So I hope you found this interesting, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe, give a like, or maybe even lend us some support over at Patreon. We've recently had another member poll to decide an upcoming video, which will be announced soon. I'll see you again before you know it. So until then, don't be a jerk to a geisha, or to anyone really. Mata ne.